Well, welcome everyone to our fourth session in our study of the Old Testament in the New. This is our continuing series this summer for how New Testament authors make use of the Hebrew Scriptures. As I've mentioned before, I'm really not a big fan of calling the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, but I've had to knuckle under for this particular series, and so I'll just do what I have to do. But Hebrew Scriptures does come more naturally to me. One of the things that I've mentioned before that I love to look for is I love to look for those connections between one text and another. And you can define text broadly, whether that's an actual book, it could be a short story, it could be a painting that refers to something else. It could be a movie or a television program. One of the ones I was thinking of in anticipation for today's lecture is the wonderful BBC series Sherlock. When I was a teenager, I got hooked on the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle and just ravenously plowed through them. I ended up reading all the way through them again later, and I've read a couple of them here and there along the way. And there've been some wonderful different series that have been produced about the Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, this new one that has, I think, now done four seasons, it seems like, Sherlock by BBC is just magnificent. It has Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock, and he just does a great job. It's one of the things that's so interesting about it is that rather than make any sort of attempt to go back to 19th century Victorian England, what they've done is they have just set it right in modern England. And so it's the updating that really is so fascinating. Whether it's the first episode, which is called A Study in Pink, rather than A Study in Scarlet. You've got little details like the fact that if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan, you may remember that one of the ways that Sherlock first figures out some things about Watson is he looks at his pocket watch. And he can tell that it has scratches where the key for winding it is supposed to go in. And so he knows that this must have been the pocket watch of someone who has a drinking problem. Well, Watson doesn't have a drinking problem, so he deduces that it was a gift to him. Well, in this updated version, it's not a pocket watch. Well, you can guess, it's a cell phone. And so this time Sherlock is looking and he sees the scratches where the power cable is supposed to go in and so forth. And so it's those kind of little connections like that. Instead of a three pipe problem like you would have found back in A Study in Scarlet, it's a three nicotine patch problem that he's going to have in the new version. And you may all remember that incredible scene where Sherlock and Moriarty plunge over the Reichenbach Fall in that episode called The Final Problem. Well, in this one, it'll be a little bit different, in fact, a good bit different, but the plunge will take place from St. Bart's Hospital in London. But it's those kind of updatings that make the series so interesting. And you can tell what they're doing in that series. They have let the old Sherlock Holmes stories sort of create the backdrop. They've created the script. They've created the game plan, the footsteps, if you will, for how the episodes are supposed to work. And then if you're the modern director, what you're trying to do is figure out, okay, how do I follow faithfully in those footsteps, while at the same time updating things and getting across this new story that I want to get across. Well, this is one of the ways that you can see biblical authors interacting with other biblical material. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 104. This is a psalm that is honestly one of the very first commentaries in all of human history. Psalm 104 is a commentary on Genesis 1. And so what it does is it takes the 7 days of creation and then it just re-expresses them in poetic form. And so where Genesis 1 would say, let there be light, what Psalm 104 will say is that God is wrapped in a garment like light, or wrapped with light as a garment. So I'm stumbling all over how the proper wording of that goes because I don't have it in front of me. Instead of the dome that God creates on day 2 in Genesis 1, it's you stretch out the heavens like a tent. And so it just goes on from there, and it walks through each of the days of creation, and you can tell that it's borrowing from it because it follows the same odd order that Genesis 1 has. If you read Genesis 1 carefully, you know that light is created on day 1. Well, the lights sun, moon, and stars, they're not created until day 4. And there's a specific literary and theological reason for that in Genesis 1. Well, you have to be, really following what Psalm 1 is doing to duplicate that in Psalm 104. And that's exactly what happens. The poet who composed Psalm 104 delays the creation of the sun, moon, and stars until midway through the psalm. You can tell that he's following the script. He's letting Genesis 1 provide the backdrop, the footsteps that he's going to walk in his own psalm. Well, this happens in the New Testament as well. You have places where a biblical story, a book from or a story from the Hebrew Bible, will provide the script for something that happens in the New Testament. And that's going to be particularly relevant in what we talk about today. Our subject for today, we've walked through things like the birth of Jesus and Jesus' preparation for ministry and so forth. Well, our subject for today is going to be Jesus and the law. In our next few sessions, we're going to be looking at different ways that Jesus interacts with Scripture, and there's just no better place to start with that than with the law, because Jesus is going to have a lot to say about the law. The gospel that I'm going to focus on especially as we do this will be the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is very committed to the law, I think, as we'll see over the course of this lecture. And one of the ways that you can pick up on this is that Matthew is going to cast Jesus as the new Moses. And the way that he'll do this is he'll let the script of the life of Moses organize the way that he presents the birth and early ministry of Jesus. So Jesus in Matthew will be the new Moses. This is one of the ways that you can interact with the Hebrew Scriptures if you're in the New Testament. You let it provide the footsteps that you're going to walk in. So what are the connections that we see between the life of Jesus and the life of Moses? Well, it starts off with a dangerous birth. Now, you'll all remember from the story of Moses that here the Israelites are down in Egypt, and Pharaoh has become intimidated by the growing numbers of the Israelites, and so he decides that he's going to kill off the Israelite boys. So this is that dangerous moment for Moses in Egypt, is that threat from Pharaoh. Well, the same thing is going to happen in the New Testament, except this time it won't be from Pharaoh. It'll be from another tyrannical king, King Herod. In Matthew chapter 2, this is what we read. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, the same time frame as what Pharaoh had said for the Hebrew boys back in the book of Exodus. And so it says, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. And we talked about that allusion there to Jeremiah 31 when it mentions Rachel weeping for her children. For our purposes here, though, what we're more interested in is the way that Matthew has drawn a parallel between Jesus' experience in Bethlehem and what happened to Moses down in Egypt. Now, importantly, only Matthew's going to mention this. So Luke has his own things concerning the birth of Jesus that he'll mention. The one that Matthew is sure to mention has to do with the Moses connection. Okay, so that's one. All right, a second connection. Well, a second connection between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus will be this supernatural protection in Egypt. So obviously you know the story of Moses. What happens is when the midwives refuse to follow through with Pharaoh's decree, when they refuse to kill the Hebrew boys, and in a different context we could talk about how foolish Pharaoh is being depicted in this particular story. When the midwives refuse to cooperate with this, that's when Pharaoh gives his edict. Okay, kill them all. Kill all of the Hebrew boys that are 2 years old and younger. Well, this is what gets Moses' mother, Yocheved, to say, I'm going to have to hide this kid. And when she can't hide him anymore, she comes up with this idea of putting him in this little basket. Now, that in and of itself is an inner biblical allusion. What she puts him in, well, it may be a basket, but it's not the word basket that's used in the book of Exodus. The word that they use is the word teva. Teva only occurs in two contexts in the entire Hebrew Bible. You got 969 chapters of the Hebrew Bible, and only only two passages are going to use this word teva. Well, they are Genesis 6 through 8 and then Exodus 2. Well, what is Genesis 6 through 8? It's the story of Noah and the flood. The word for teva is the word for ark. And so you can see the connection between what happens with baby Moses and what happens in the story of the flood. That here Yocheved is going to put Moses in a little ark, and God will protect Moses through the dangerous waters. That's the same thing that happens in the story of the flood, as here Noah and his family are put into an ark, and God protects them through the dangerous waters. So you can see, even in the Hebrew Bible, allusions over to other Hebrew Bible passages. Well, what's the connection with the life of Jesus? Well, let me read from Matthew 2 again. It says here, and the wise men here, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through his prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So here in this passage, what we're reading about is the flight to Egypt. This is that story where when the wise men first encounter Herod, Herod says, "Oh, yes, I'd love to go and pay homage to this little kid, too." Well, of course, Herod had no such designs in mind. This was a terribly paranoid king, and he would have killed off any sort of competitor just as quickly as he could have thought of it. Well, when the wise men are warned not to go back to Herod, Joseph is warned, "Take your family down to Egypt." And so that's what he does. This is that famous story that's called the flight to Egypt. And I told you that the story about the kindergartner in my mother-in-law's class when he draws the airplane with the flight to Egypt and Pontius the pilot and so forth. So it's pretty comical. It was a lot of fun one time when my wife and I and our son Samuel, he was only 1 at the time. Our son Elijah had not yet been born, but we got to go down to Egypt. We were living in Israel for a couple of months. And, I can just tell you, the Holy Family, they got around when they were in Egypt. Because our tour guide, I mean, he pointed out everything that the Holy Family did. It was, this over here is the cave of whatever. This is my brother Ahmed's shop where they produce rugs. The Holy Family, this is where they buy their rugs when they were here. It was that kind of thing. It was sort of comical in many respects. Well, this flight to Egypt is where Jesus is going to be supernaturally protected in Egypt in the same way that Moses was. Well, this is significant because, again, only Matthew has this one. If you read Luke's gospel, 40 days after Jesus is born, they go to the temple, they do the purification rites, and they head right back to Nazareth. In Matthew, that's not the script that they're following. Anytime there's a Moses connection, Matthew's going to make it. And so he's the one who was sure to emphasize the flight to Egypt. Okay, so we got the dangerous birth, we got the flight to Egypt. The next thing is there is the passing through the waters. Well, you know your story, the Exodus, that after the plagues have happened, after Passover and that terrible 10th plague, the Israelites, they finally leave Egypt, and now they have to cross through the Red Sea. Now, technically in Hebrew, this is called Yam Suf, which means sea of reeds. It doesn't mean that it's like a field of grass or something like that. It's just a body of water that was known for the reeds that grew around it. It does kind of tell us that it wasn't the actual Red Sea, which is a saltwater body. These reeds only grow around fresh water, but that's kind of immaterial to the miracle that takes place there. Well, you know what happens is that Moses and the Israelites, they pass through the waters, and then they are, miraculously delivered from the forces of Pharaoh's army. And they go into Sinai from there. We'll talk about that in a minute. Well, how does this connect with Jesus? Well, to fully catch this, you have to pick up on something that happens not just at the beginning of Israel's wilderness experience with Moses, but also at the end. See, the wilderness experience for the children of Israel is bookended by water crossings. When we get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy and Moses dies, his successor will be Joshua. And the way that Joshua follows in the footsteps, literally, of his mentor Moses will be to do the same kind of passing through water. This is where the Israelites pass, not through the Red Sea or even the Reed Sea. What they pass through this time is the Jordan River. You remember that the waters stop and then they walk through on dry land and they set up the stone monuments so that their children will one day say, well, what is this? Well, the reason why, frankly, this is another inner biblical illusion. This is another place where an early story is setting the script for a later story. So Moses crossing through the sea with the Israelites is setting the script for what Joshua will do when Joshua enters into the promised land and leaves the wilderness with the Israelites. They pass through the waters of the Jordan. Well, those two events, they're both the water crossing events. They're kind of like two sides of one coin, I guess would be one way to put it. Well, how does this connect with the life of Jesus? It's with his baptism. The way that the baptism of Jesus would have worked is he's coming down from Galilee. He would have been over in what today is the country of Jordan. And now, and the reason that you do this is because it's flatter over there. So you cross over to the other side, you walk down that nice flat area that is in the Eastern Plateau, and then you have to make your way from Jordan up to Jerusalem. You see this all over the Gospels, frankly. They take this path. All right, so now it's going to cross and go up to Jerusalem. Well, there's a bridge that you can cross over. Except this time, instead of crossing over the bridge, there's this wild-eyed character that we talked about last week, John the Baptist. And he's there encouraging people not to cross over the bridge, but to cross through the waters. This is almost certainly what John the Baptist's baptism is that he's telling them, cross through the Jordan River. Much like when Joshua led the Israelites, it's a new beginning. And this is going to be this moment where, it fulfills John's message of repentance and so forth. Well, here's the way Matthew 3 puts it. It says, Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, well, hold on there. I need to be baptized by you, and yet you're coming to me. And Jesus answered, let it be so now, for it's proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. It's a fancy term, but what it really means is it's the right thing to do, John. And so that's when John consents and he lets Jesus be baptized there. Well, what's Jesus doing? He's crossing through the waters of the Jordan River. So it's another connection between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. They're both going to cross through the waters. Okay, so what's next? Well, right after Jesus is baptized, in all three of the Gospels when this happens, all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is going to go into the wilderness. Okay, well, what kind of connection is there? The Israelites are in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. That's our connection. And what are the struggles that the Israelites have in the wilderness? Well, it's temptations. It's temptations about food and water and worshiping other gods, like the golden calf. So what's going to happen in the life of Jesus? Well, listen to Matthew 4. It says, then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. Y'all, I confess, I love that line. Anytime the Bible does one of those sort of state the obvious moments like Matthew does here, 40 days and 40 nights, and so he was hungry. Thank you, Matthew. We would not have gotten that one. The tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So here's our connection. What's the temptation for Jesus? It's about bread. Well, what is it that the Israelites are going to complain about in the wilderness? Bread. They're going to first say, we don't have any bread. And then when they finally get the bread, the manna, they're going to complain about that too. All right, the second temptation. Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Now, in context, what this is Jesus is being tempted to fully and clearly manifest himself as the Messiah, and that way he won't have to go through the cross. But Jesus is going to say, no, do not put the Lord your God to the test. He's quoting from Deuteronomy there. So finally, the third temptation. It says, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, all these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me. Jesus said, away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. So what's that third temptation? Well, it's meant to echo the golden calf. Bow down and worship this other God, this false God. And Jesus is going to quote from Deuteronomy, again, in a passage that has to do with, no, we're not going to do the mistake that we made in the wilderness. We're going to worship the Lord and the Lord only. So first we've had this dangerous birth. Then we had this supernatural protection in Egypt. Then we had the crossing through the waters. Then the wilderness experience. So what is it that happens next? What happens in the wilderness with the Israelites? Well, what happens is they get the law at Sinai. Excuse me. And so what is it that's going to happen that parallels that with the life of Jesus? Well, it's going to be the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew's Gospel, as soon as Jesus comes back from his wilderness experience, he's going to make his way back up to Galilee, and there he's going to deliver a sermon on a mountain. Now, if you look at Luke's version of this, Luke says it's a flat place, or a level place. Matthew says it's a mountain. Well, you can go there today. It's just up the shores from the Sea of Galilee. You look at it, it's kind of a hill. It would remind you a little bit of, say Sanford's campus. I don't know if we'd call it Mount Sanford. On the other hand, I don't know if we'd call it exactly flat either. It depends on how late you are to class and which direction you're going. Well, here, why is it that Matthew would be so careful to call it a mountain? It's because he's trying to draw a connection between Jesus and his Sermon on the Mountain and Moses and his receiving the law on the mountain. And what do these two have in common? They're both about the law. They're both about Torah. Moses goes up onto the mountain and he's going to get the 10 Commandments. He's going to get the Book of the Covenant. He's going to get the law. And what is it that Jesus is going to do on the Sermon on the Mount, or in the Sermon on the Mount, on this mountain? He's going to talk for chapter after chapter about how do we follow the law. In the book of Matthew, Jesus is being presented as the new Moses. The way that Matthew is alluding to the Hebrew Scriptures, the way he's interpreting the Hebrew Scriptures, is that he's letting the life of Moses sort of provide the footsteps that Jesus will walk in. And so a lot of this material that we call special Matthew, these things that only Matthew has, they're there to draw out each and every connection that Matthew can find with the life of Moses. Luke, he'll do it differently. Luke intends to sort of set Jesus in the context of the Roman Empire. He's going to present the birth of Jesus as an alternative to the announcement of a new emperor in Rome, that kind of thing. So he'll emphasize different things. Matthew says Jesus is the new Moses. So if Jesus is the new Moses, well, what does this new Moses have to say about the law? So what is it that Matthew has to say about the law in Matthew's gospel? What is it that Jesus has to say about the law in this gospel? Law is really going to permeate this gospel almost from one end to the other. You can just see this stamp on Matthew's gospel of trying to present Jesus as this new Moses-like figure. Just as a small example of this, there are, several different places where the gospel writers get their material, both Luke and Matthew. They copy from Mark's gospel, and then they also have their own individual traditions. They call that either special Matthew or special Luke. Well, one other thing that they get is what's called Q. This is, it's a short form of the word for Quelle, or source in German, and this is probably what was a sayings source back in the time of the New Testament, and so Matthew and Luke drew upon it. Well, Luke just disperses his Q material all through the gospel, not Matthew. Matthew takes almost all the Q material and he arranges it into sermons, long sermons, 5 long sermons. Well, if the number 5 comes up, it's almost always a reference to the Torah. You have, really common biblical numbers, 7 and 12 and 40 and so forth. 5 is not really one of those numbers. It doesn't come up that much. When it does come up, very often, it has something to do with the Torah, with the law. Well, this is the way that Matthew has Jesus' sermons arranged. Well, in one of these sermons, it's by far the most famous of Jesus' sermons, it's the Sermon on the Mount. This is where we have the Beatitudes and things like that. Well, Jesus here will have a general statement about his approach to the law and the approach that he expects his followers to pursue. So let me read this general statement, and I'm going to break it out a little bit and come up with some ideas that I want to walk through for the rest of Matthew. This is Matthew 5, verses 17 to 20. You'll have all heard this before. It says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So that's a very bold passage, and we're going to look at it in some detail here. My point for now is that I think Jesus is going to make three central claims in this initial statement about the law. These three claims, they're going to be borne out all through the rest of Matthew's gospel. So his first claim is going to be this: I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets. Okay? He says, instead, I came to fulfill them. So that'll be statement number one. Statement number two is where he says, nothing is going to pass away from the law. He'll have that line about not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen. And then thirdly, he's going to say that his followers' righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. So I want to address all three of these ideas, but I want to actually take them a little bit out of order. So let me do that with us. We'll start off with this idea here about do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. Well, this one's in order. This is the idea where Jesus is saying nothing is going to pass away. Now, Jesus is going to use this a bit of hyperbole here when he says not the smallest letter, not the smallest stroke of a letter can pass away. I'm not usually a big fan of the New International Version's method of translation, but I do like the way they put it in this particular case. It says, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen. Well, what is he talking about there? Well, if you know your King James Version of this passage, then you get part of the way to figuring it out. You remember that's the place where in the King James it says, not a jot or a tittle will pass away. Well, the tittle part we'll have to explain a little bit more, but the jot we can figure out. So what is this jot? Well, it's from the Greek word iota. Well, we don't say iota, we say iota. So you've heard the expression not one iota, and what we mean by that is not one little bit. Well, why do we say that? It's because the Greek letter iota is actually the smallest of the letters. It's this tiny little letter. And so we've kept the word iota as jot in German and then jot in English. And we mean this even today for a kind of diminutive sort of writing, to jot something down. You don't jot down a novel, you jot down a sticky note. So it's something that's diminutive, this iota. Well, where does the word iota come from? Iota, the Greek word. Well, it comes from not really quite the Hebrew, but the Phoenician word yod. And sure enough, in the Phoenician alphabet, eventually in the Hebrew alphabet, which also borrows from Phoenician, in that alphabet, yod is this tiny little letter, about a quarter of the size of all of the other letters. You will never convince me that they don't get the name Yoda from the Hebrew letter yod. So here, Jesus is saying, not even the smallest little letter. If we were to do it ourselves, we probably would use something like a lowercase I as our word for, not even that smallest little letter. Okay, so if not the smallest letter can disappear, well, what is this tittle? What is this least stroke of a pen? Well, there are certain letters in Hebrew which are very similar to one another, just like we have letters in English that are very similar to one another. If you think, for example, take a capital E and a capital F. Well, what's the difference between the two? The only difference is that one little leg at the bottom is what separates an E from an F. Or you might think of another one. Think about a lowercase g. Well, that lowercase g has that little swoop that goes this way. If you just take that swoop and go that way, well, then you don't have a G anymore. Now you have a Q. So those tiny little strokes of letters, just that one little thing that turns an O into a Q. In Hebrew, they have one that's even smaller. Now, there's no way to really show you this, except I'll try visually. If you have a letter that does this, it's an R. If it does that, it's a D. That little bit right there is what Jesus is talking about. Now, there are all kinds of texts in the Hebrew Bible where people mistake one of those letters from the other. Instead of putting an R at the end of a word, they put a D at the end of a word, or vice versa. So what Jesus is saying here, it surely can't be something to do with not ever being able to have a typographical error if you're a scribe. I mean, we have all kinds of typographical errors that the scribes have made. I mean, for heaven's sakes, there's actually a Bible that is jokingly called the Adulterer's Bible. Well, why would they call it that? It's because a printer in the 1800s, he produced a Bible, maybe in the 1700s, but it's 17 or 1800s. He produced a Bible, and he accidentally, and genuinely, he did accidentally leave out a word. Well, when you leave out that word from the seventh commandment, then suddenly instead of saying thou shalt not commit adultery, you have said thou shalt commit adultery. Apparently politicians flocked to find copies of this Bible and put it on their shelves just as fast as they could do it. Well, no, not really. What happened was the poor guy lost his license to print the Bible. He was licensed by the king, and so he lost that license to be a printer of it. You can definitely make a typographical error. So what does Jesus mean by this? He means hyperbolically, every last little detail will continue to count in the law. Well, what does Jesus mean by this when he says that? Well, if you look in the Gospel of Matthew, you can see that Jesus is committed to every bit of the law. Sometimes you'll hear of a distinction between, say, the moral laws, things like, don't commit adultery or don't steal, and then the ritual laws, things like tithing or sacrificing and so forth. And so some theologians would say, well, we're obligated to follow the moral law, but not the ritual law. Jesus does not take that approach in Matthew. Jesus remains fully committed to both of these parts of the law. In the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus is going to talk about his followers giving alms to the poor, about praying, about fasting, about tithing, all of those kind of ritual aspects of the law. There's one particular passage where he talks about tithing spices. Some of you may have heard this before. This is in Matthew 23:23. The text says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Jesus was real politic in his way of preaching. "For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith." Well, I don't know about you, but in the church where I grew up, my youth pastor would have said, see, Jesus doesn't care about the mint and the dill and the cumin. It's the justice and the mercy and faith. That's what Jesus wants. That may be, but it's not what Matthew says. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus' next line is, "It is these that you ought to have practiced." Okay, justice, mercy, and faith. It is these that you ought to have practiced. The next four words, though, without neglecting the others. In other words, Jesus, he's not just saying to the Pharisees, "Oh, you silly Pharisees, I can't believe you would tithe from your spices." He just wants the tithing from the spices accompanied by the justice and the mercy and the faith. Jesus is committed even to this ritual idea of tithing the spices. Well, what about the Sabbath? Well, in the end of the Gospel of Mark, toward the end, just before the Passion narratives, there's this long apocalyptic discourse that Jesus gives. And he warns the people of trouble that's coming. And he has this particular line in there. When he's talking about how people might have to flee, he says, "Pray that it might not be in winter. For in those days there will be suffering such as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now." So he says, pray that it may not be in winter. Okay. Well, here's what Matthew says. He says, this is Matthew 24, verse 20, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." In other words, Matthew doesn't believe, and he's presenting Jesus as not believing, that his followers would be able to flee if it were a Sabbath day. That's a very strong commitment to the Sabbath, to be that connected with the Sabbath that even if you were being, hounded, you couldn't flee on the Sabbath. Well, what about the food laws? Well, there's a passage in Mark where Mark comes to the conclusion that the food laws are no longer, still valid. He has this line where the Pharisees come and they criticize the disciples and they say, or criticize Jesus for his disciples. They say, why do your disciples eat with defiled hands? Now, it sounds, pretty awful. What in the world is wrong with their hands? Well, all it really is they haven't done the kind of ritual washing that the Pharisees were famous for. Jesus is going to respond to this and say, come on, guys. It's not what goes into a person that makes a person unclean. It's what comes out of a person's mouth. That's what makes them unclean. Well, Mark inserts a little theological parenthetical. He says in Mark 15, verse 19, thus he declared all foods clean. So in other words, Mark concludes, well, if what goes into you can't make you unclean, then it must be that foods are not clean and unclean. Everything's okay. Matthew does not buy that conclusion. When Matthew copies Mark's passage, he says, then he said to him, are you also still without understanding? Do you see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart? And he goes on from there. The one line that he does not include is Mark's line, thus he declared all foods clean. Matthew doesn't buy that idea. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is being presented as particularly connected with the law. So much so that Jesus says nothing from the law goes away. In fact, you can tell that Jesus' line there, it actually has an edge to it when he says, do not think that I came to abolish the law. When you say do not think, you're admitting that people in your audience are already thinking this. It's kind of like, when my sons are getting ready to leave the house, and my wife says to them, don't you think for 1 second that you're going to leave the house with your room looking like that. Well, what she's saying to them is, look, guys, I know you're already thinking that you're going to leave the house with your room looking like that. Jesus is here dispelling a notion that somehow he had come to get rid of the law. He says, I did not come to get rid of the law. I came to fulfill it. And I'll explain in a minute what I think this fulfill word actually means. So one of the ideas that Jesus is going to have in this short passage here in Matthew 5, 17 to 20, is this idea that nothing will pass away from the law. So Jesus is presented in the Gospel of Matthew as subscribing to all of the commandments, not just the moral commandments, but even the ritual commandments as well. Okay, so the second idea, and that is that your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. So how do we see this in Matthew's gospel? How does Jesus explain this notion in the gospel? Well, it's in that series of intensifications that Jesus offers in the Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about the things that the people have heard from the law. So here's one, for example, when Jesus talks about murder. It says in Matthew 5:21, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. I say to you that if you're angry with your brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So the commandment in the Ten Commandments is, thou shalt not murder. Here, Jesus is going to drill down on this one in a serious way. I have an almost perfect record of not murdering anyone. Okay. Now, I guess it is a perfect record. I haven't killed anyone yet, and that is despite having to drive up I-65 on a regular basis. It is the main reason why we don't live out on 280, because God says that he won't give you a temptation that's greater than you can bear, and that would probably be too much for me. Okay, I've never killed anybody, but I got a list of people that I have been angry at. I'm a nice guy. I call myself your beloved professor when I'm talking to my students, but I have a terrible temper. Thankfully, my temper usually only comes out when it's related to inanimate objects that will not submit to my will. My wife loves to regale people with the story of a VCR that ate one too many tapes and has now gone to be with Jesus. I actually think that it may be in the other place, but that's a different matter. I do get angry. And I'm not the only one who gets angry. We all get angry. And if we don't get angry on a regular basis, well, there are others of us that we have a problem that maybe we do say something that's critical of somebody else, where we say something that's equivalent to that "you fool" kind of line there. I have a perfect track record of not murdering anybody, not getting angry, not insulting someone. I'm in trouble on that one. Jesus has intensified the commandment. He said it's not enough just to follow the "thou shalt not murder." We need to dig deeper and see what this really means. He's going to do the same thing when it comes to adultery. The command there says, "You've heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. I say that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Well, I've never committed adultery, never lusting at all. Like most of you, I would assume, I can't claim a perfect record on that one. Now, I'm willing to accept that there's an element of hyperbole in the way that Jesus is describing these things. After all, if you continue on in that passage about adultery, it says that if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. Or if your right hand causes you to sin, then cut it off. Well, I find it difficult to believe that Jesus thinks that if we cut our right hands off and only look with our left eyes, that somehow everything will be okay, because you can't lust with your left eye, right? I don't think that's it. I don't think Jesus intends for anybody to pluck their eyes out and cut their hands off. He's using hyperbole to say that the command about adultery involves more than adultery. It involves our thought lives too. This is what Jesus means when he talks about your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. You're going to have to take a more full-orbed approach to how you approach the commands. He's going to say concerning swearing, you have heard that it was said in ancient times, don't swear falsely. Carry out the vows that you've made. Well, Jesus is going to say, I say to you, don't swear at all. Either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Don't swear by your head, because you can't make one hair white or black. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Jesus is dramatically expanding the way that the commands work. And so this is what is meant in Matthew's gospel. This is what Jesus means when he says, this is how you are to interpret the law. Now, there's some parallel to this in Judaism. For example, there's this idea of putting a fence around the law. And so, for example, when we're dealing with the Sabbath, there will be more and more and more commands that are put up to make sure that our actions can't violate the Sabbath. Well, Jesus is doing the same thing here. He's not doing it so much with a ritual component like the Sabbath. That's not really going to be his approach. But he's definitely doing that with these moral commands. He's saying it's not enough just to say, well, I didn't kill anybody. Don't hate anybody either. Boy, could we hear that one. It's not just don't commit adultery. It's don't lust. Jesus is intensifying the commands, and not just the ritual commands. He's intensifying the moral commands. All right, so that's our second idea. Our third and our last idea is this. When Jesus says that he didn't come to abolish the law, instead he came to fulfill the law. Well, what I think this means is Jesus came to show us how to do the law. That's what fulfill means here. I've already mentioned that I don't think fulfill in Matthew really has anything to do with, a simple prophecy fulfillment scheme. It's something bigger than that. It's embodiment. Well, I think the idea here is the same, is that Jesus has come to embody the way that we are supposed to live out the law. So how does that work in Matthew? What does Jesus say in Matthew about the law? Well, we already talked about one thing. One is you got to tie the spirit together with the letter. And so what that means is that you got to follow more than just don't murder or don't commit adultery. You got to dig into the spirit of the law as well. And that's actually a little bit of a different approach than the way Paul approaches this whole spirit versus letter issue. The second thing is Matthew is going to emphasize, Jesus in Matthew is going to emphasize that while ritual is still valid, ritual is still important, preserving life actually trumps ritual. So there's a story, and we can see this in Mark, we can see it again in Matthew. I'm going to read the Matthean version since that's where we are. It says in Matthew 12:1 that at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, So what the disciples are doing here is they're just picking these little heads of grain. You rub them in your hands to get the chaff off, and then you eat the little, barley or wheat berry. You wouldn't make a meal of it. It's kind of like eating green peanuts or something like that. But it's a snack. On the other hand, the Pharisees are right. Not supposed to do that. It's agriculture. You may not be running a combine through the fields of the, Yavniel Valley out in Israel, but you are doing agriculture on the Sabbath. And so they criticize them for this. Notice how Jesus responds. He says in verse 3, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priest." So Jesus here is going to make a comparison back to what happened this time with David, where David and his men, they're starving to death. They stop at a little town called Nov. They ask for bread. They say, "We don't have any." The only bread they have is the temple bread. And they say, "Well, you can't eat that because you're not priest." And David says, "It's okay, give it to me." Now, Matthew doesn't actually go on and fully explain the logic of the comparison that he's made. Here you could just look at it and go, "I don't see how this helps, Jesus. All you've did is said, well, David broke the law, and so are we." That's not actually the way that this paragraph is going to end in Mark's gospel. Mark has this one additional line where he says, "The Sabbath was made for human beings, and not human beings for the Sabbath." And that's actually a very important interpretive clue there. This is that interpretive key that tells us what Jesus means. He means if you're following the command in such a way that it's hurting life rather than helping life, then you're doing it wrong. Jesus gave this command to be a blessing and not a curse. You're supposed to put human life in front of this ritual requirement. That's the way that this works. And so why is it okay for David and his men to eat the bread and violate the Shabbat? Well, it's because they're hungry. Why is it okay for the disciples to do the same? The same reason. Human life trumps ritual requirements. You can see that in another story that Jesus has, and it's right after this one in Matthew. It says, "He left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, 'Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?' so that they might accuse him. He said to them, 'Suppose one of you has a sheep and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath.' Then he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and it was restored as sound as the other." I think Mark here also has another interpretive key in here that's worth reading. This is where, in that same story, Jesus is going to say to the Pharisees there, he says, "You tell me, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" It must have been just awful to have to argue with Jesus. Here he's got them, right on the point of this dilemma. Well, what are they going to say? If you say it's lawful to do good, if it's lawful to save life, well, then he's going to heal the guy, and that's not what they want. On the other hand, you can't say that you're supposed to do harm on the Sabbath, that you're supposed to kill on the Sabbath. So the text says in Mark, they were silent. And Jesus' response, he looked around at them with anger and was grieved at their hardness of heart. Well, Matthew has that similar kind of core of the story there. And the point of it, again, is the commands were given to help us, not to hurt us. That saving human life takes precedence over a commandment. You could think about this in a very simple way. We're commanded in the Bible to tell the truth. On the other hand, there are lots of occasions in the Bible where people lie and are commended for lying. Rahab, when she saves the spies in Jericho, or the midwives, when they lie to Pharaoh. They're commended for doing these things. Well, why? How could they be commended for lying? It's because saving life is more important than telling the truth. You could think about another circumstance. What are you supposed to do when the Bible tells us to tell the truth, and the Bible tells us to submit to the government, and the German forces are saying, produce any of the Jews who are staying in your house? Is it okay to hide those Jews? Is it okay to lie? Well, I think on some level we just know instinctively it's got to be okay. But the truth is, the Bible is quite explicit on this point. These commands were meant to save life, to help life, not to hurt life. If you're doing the commands in such a way that you're killing life, you're doing them incorrectly. So this is one of the ways that Jesus embodies the commandments. It's one of the ways that he fulfills those commandments for us. And then one other thing that I'll mention, and I'll kind of close on this one, is that ritual has to be accompanied by righteousness. And we've already seen this before. When Jesus says to the Pharisees, you're tithing from mint and dill and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law. This is vital. You have to be doing that justice and mercy in faith, or following the other commandments doesn't help at all. There'll be another passage where in fact, it's in that same passage. It has to do with the disciples walking through the grain fields. Jesus is going to say, as part of that argument there, he says, I tell you that if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, then you would not have condemned the guiltless. Well, what's going on in that same passage is that Jesus is saying you have to combine your ritual commitments to a commitment to righteous living, living out righteousness in the community, serving the cause of justice and caring for others in the community. And I'll close with just this one kind of parallel to the Hebrew Bible. It's the book of Amos. The targets of Amos's, just withering sermons in the north of Israel, they were all over sacrifices. They were sacrificing all the time. They were giving gifts to the temple up there and so forth. And what does Amos say? He says, away with them. I don't want those sacrifices. I don't want your songs. I don't want your prayers. I don't want any of that stuff if it's not accompanied by justice. If you're not willing to live out a just and righteous life toward other members of the community, then you cannot make up for that with all of your worship. This is how Jesus embodies the law and commands his followers to embody the law in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is the new Moses, and he says that as the new lawgiver, that his commands are not going to go away. He goes on from there and he says, not only are they not going to go away, but my followers are going to be followers who follow those commands intensely, far more than the scribes and the Pharisees. But how exactly is it that we follow those commands? Well, we do it by wedding ritual to righteousness. We do it by not just following things like the Sabbath, for example, but we do it by also expressing a commitment to love and faith and mercy and justice toward other people. I think that is how Jesus interprets the law.